I call the honourable member Grant Robertson.
It has been a long 5 years under this government, Mr Speaker, but I want to take us back to John Key's statement of November 2008. Quote, "I expect high standards from my ministers. If they don't meet the standards I set, then obviously I will take action if necessary." John Key, November 2008. And consistently, under John Key's leadership, the standards of ministerial behaviour have dropped further and further and further. And John Banks resigned yesterday. Well, you know the truth, Mr Speaker. Every piece of information that came out yesterday, John Key knew last September, and he did nothing. He managed to forget everything that John Banks had said to him or his chief of staff, and he managed to turn a blind eye to the conduct that lowered the standards of ministerial behaviour. John Key has managed to combine amnesia with willful blindness to create a shonky, tawdry government that is now propped up by a disgraced MP. That's where the government of New Zealand is left today. A tawdry, shonky, shoddy government propped up by John Banks and Peter Dunn, two disgraced MPs. That's what it has come to under John Key's leadership. But perhaps we shouldn't be surprised, Mr Speaker, because in the midst of the trouble for John Banks last year, here's what John Key said about John Banks. "There is quite a wide definition of ethics. The test I have to apply is the law. I think he did exactly what he had always said, which was comply with the law." That's what John Key said. He took John Banks's word, he tells us. Well, what a big mistake that was for John Key. And doesn't the Prime Minister now regret not reading the police report on John Banks? Because, Mr Speaker, what that police report told everybody in this country was that John Banks had filed a false return. Now, this is not a matter that is up for debate in the current trial. That is an established fact that John Banks filed a false return. So John Key's test that a minister has to obey the law has already been broken by John Banks, Mr Speaker. And John Key would have known that if he hadn't willfully decided not to read the police report. And there is only one reason for that, Mr Speaker. There is only one reason for John Key lowering the standards of ministerial behaviour so low, is because of his desperate, venal attempt to hang on to power. This tawdry government that we have in front of us today is clinging on the basis of disgraceful behaviour from one of the ministers. And we need to look at what the Cabinet manuals say. Because while John Key might think that there is, quote, a wide definition of ethics, what the Cabinet manual says is ministers are expected to act lawfully and to behave in a way that upholds and is seen to uphold the highest ethical standards. That's not a wide definition of ethics, Mr Speaker. And from day one in this government, John Key has let New Zealanders down when it comes to what standards are acceptable. And today in the House, we saw another chapter. And mark my words, Mr Speaker, the role of dishonour in this government isn't over. Nick Smith will be back in this House having to apologise. He will be, I predict, in front of the correct authorities in this complex to justify the fact that he intervened inappropriately. And that is the record of this government. Taking away New Zealanders' democratic rights, intervening in processes, and not behaving in a way that most New Zealanders would regard as acceptable. And so this is the standard we have of John Key's government. This is the style of John Key's leadership. Anything goes as long as it justifies the ends. The classic money traders approach. One day you'll trade a currency up, the next day you'll trade a currency down. He used to do that with the New Zealand currency, actually, John Key. And that's the approach that he takes to the way that he leads a government. There's no moral compass. In fact, I'm going to credit my colleague Moana Maki for this, because she said very early on, I think before John Key became Prime Minister, he's all map and no compass. That's what John Key is, all map and no compass. He knows he wants to be the Prime Minister, but he doesn't care about what he's doing, and he'll try and stay in government at all costs. Any shonky deals on the table, and let's just remember how John Banks even came to be in this house. A cup of tea, that's what it is, the most expensive cup of tea ever sold in Epsom, in my view. John Banks is in this house because of a dodgy deal. John Banks is in this house to ensure that the National Party's cronies continue to be rewarded. And what about the ACT Party, Mr. Speaker? The ACT Party. I can remember the Right Honourable Helen Clark saying, when she stood up in the House, I might disagree with everything that the ACT Party stands for, but at least they have a principle that they're here for, an ideological principle. Well, that time is long gone. And it started off with David Garrett. I don't think I'll ever forget hearing David Garrett stand up in this house and say, I stole a dead baby's identity, a disgraceful thing. Then we had Don Brash with his hostile takeover of the ACT Party. And now we have John Banks, a man who clearly doesn't even believe in those principles, is only here to support the National Party. Rodney Hyde as well, he disappeared in the middle of that. The ACT Party is over. It's over, it's done, they will not be back. But John Banks has played a role to prop up this government, to allow this government to go ahead with policies and laws that fundamentally undermine our democracy and that fundamentally go against what New Zealanders want. And Bill English stood up in the House today twice to tell New Zealanders that they've got a great majority, the national government. Well, look at the GCSB bill. Look at the asset sales. Passed by one vote. Passed with the slimmest possible majority in this House. And that is down to the dodgy, sleazy deals that are done by this government. That is down to Peter Dunn, the self-described willing buyer, willing seller on the GCSB bill. And now John Banks, a discredited MP, an MP who has indulged in what Annette King calls terminological inexactitude on a regular basis, Mr. Speaker. Terminological inexactitude towards the Prime Minister, his Chief of Staff, and to all New Zealanders. Because, Mr. Speaker, while John Banks might now be in front of the court, he was convicted in the court of public opinion last year. New Zealanders do not trust his word because it simply does not make any sense what he's saying. And as I've already stated, the police report was quite clear. A false return was put in place. We have heard many pieces of evidence in this case that point to the fact that John Key was misled by John Banks. That's the point at which John Key should have stepped in. September last year, he had the opportunity to do it. He did not take that opportunity, Mr. Speaker. And that is because he is clinging on to power. He is hugging the political corpse that is John Banks because he is so desperate to survive for the next year or so. Well, Mr. Speaker, the message I have from the Labour Party is to the National Party is call that snap election. Go ahead, call that snap election because we know that we can win it. We know that we have the agenda that New Zealanders want. This is a tired, tawdry government in its second term behaving like a third-term government, propped up by disgraced MPs. It is time for them to go.
Mr. Speaker.